Hey, good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller. I'm a retired U.S. Marine officer and currently serving as the President and CEO of the nonprofit Center for Security Policy. Our organization was founded over 37 years ago with a simple mission. We provide uncompromised analysis, unflinching leadership, and unconventional solutions to keep people safer. And right now there's a lack of all three of those things when it comes to at least one significant threat to our country. And it's one that just today my phone has been ringing off the hook, which I'm glad about, people asking about the threat of solar weather. Today is May 10th. The time is currently 3:25 p.m. Eastern. And people may have seen over the last 12 to 18 hours news headlines about a massive solar storm headed towards Earth. And I want to explain what that is. I want to explain what it can do. There's some bad news in this story, and then there's some good news. And unfortunately, there's also a lot of uncertainty. And so in this short video, I would just ask you to bear with me for the explanations. Stay till the end so you know what the good news is and what we can do about it. So first off, when we say a solar storm coming towards Earth, and why does that matter, right? The sun produces something called coronal mass ejections. It's highly charged magnetized particles that fly out into space, and it happens all the time. In fact, they go in all different directions, and most of the time they go off into space, and it has nothing to do with our Earth. And at some point, I'll put together a great video that shows you what these things look like, but you could search right now if you wanted and just type in, coronal mass ejection, CME, NASA or NOAA, and look at a Google image search, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So when those highly charged magnetized particles fly into space, sometimes they will connect with the Earth in our orbit, okay? And when that happens, it affects the Earth's magnetosphere. So our Earth is surrounded by a magnetosphere, and when a magnetosphere moves or heaves or wobbles, it creates electromagnetic energy or electricity. So you think about the example of your lawnmower, right? If you had a pull start engine on your lawnmower, there's a magnetosphere there where there's magnets surrounded by copper wire. You pull that cord, and the movement between those magnets and copper wire, that magnetosphere, create electromagnetic energy that then go down a line into a spark plug, right? Well, the Earth's magnetosphere, when it's struck by a massive solar storm, a coronal mass ejection, that magnetosphere literally heaves and wobbles and moves. And that movement generates electromagnetic energy. That energy then transits through the crust of the Earth. So, you might be thinking look up at the sun, but really you got to look down, so to speak. Because what's happening at that moment, and it's happening at this very moment right now, is that throughout the crust of the Earth, bouncing in between the surface and the mantle, is electromagnetic energy. And it's called ground-induced currents, or GICs, okay? And if we think about electricity, what does electricity always want to do? It wants to find the path of least resistance. And so as these geomagnetically induced currents, the ground-induced currents, GICs, pass through the crust of the Earth, they're sensing and looking, so to speak, for that path of least resistance. Now, historically, we as humans have observed this type of activity, but we really didn't observe it until the last part of the 1800s, the 19th century, in an event that a lot of people do know about called the Carrington event. 1859, a massive solar storm hit the Earth, and people actually saw Aurora Borealis as far south as Cuba. Aurora Borealis is what we call the Northern Lights, right? And why is this worrisome for us today? Okay, so if back in 1859, you could read a newspaper in New Orleans, Louisiana, down in Cuba, in a green and purple hue because of the light that they saw back then. Well, right now, newspaper articles are telling us, the media is telling us, we might see Aurora Borealis tonight and tomorrow as far south as Alabama. Okay, so a lot of people are kind of excited, like, oh, I get to go out at night and try to find a spot where I can see it. And I'm not going to say don't do that. Here's the problem. In 1859, when that happened, telegraph machine operators reported being struck with sparks telegraph keys melted, telegraph infrastructure and paper caught on fire. The entire transatlantic telegraph line had to be replaced. Why? Well, it's because those ground-induced currents sensed another conductor, a long conductor that stretched over the surface of the earth. And those currents were induced into that conductor, and they traveled down to the ends of those conductors, which were telegraph keys, and fried it. But what do we have today? We have an entire massive, wonderful machine that keeps all of us alive, called the U.S. electric grid. And that grid has long conductors, transmission lines that span across our country. And it just so happens that those transmission lines have a lot less resistance in many areas than the crust of the earth. We think about, why do they have transmission lines in the first place? To move electricity over long distances, right? When you generate electricity with massive power plants, those power plants are not usually located next to the city. So you have to transport the electricity. To transport electricity, you need high voltages, right? Because high voltages, there's low resistance. Well, if there's low resistance, that's what the ground-induced currents can sense, that low resistance. So it sees, so to speak, this transmission infrastructure as a path of least resistance. So what happens? It has happened before. In 1989, they call it the Hydro-Quebec solar storm. The grid in Quebec was blacked out for about 9 hours. And I'll show you, I don't know how well you'll be able to see it in this video, but I'm going to show you a picture of the inside of a transformer, okay? And if you can see, that's the windings on the inside of this massive transformer in Salem, New Jersey, at a nuclear power plant. That's the effect that those ground-induced currents had when they're passing through the crust of the earth. They sense that long transmission line, and they jump up through the ground wire of that transformer, and they travel over that line. And here's what happens. As they travel over that line, the current builds up. A certain amount of volts per kilometer they build up, okay? And then when they get to the other side, they do this. Now, the 1989 storm was a relatively moderate storm. They call it like a 40-year storm. The one that we have coming towards Earth right now, I honestly don't really know. I haven't had a chance to look closely at it to see how does it compare to the 1989 storm. I'm not really sure, to be honest. What I do know is that the report said it's the most severe alert in 19 years. So it's a pretty big deal, right? So now we know what a ground-induced current is. We know where it comes from the Earth's magnetosphere being struck by a coronal mass ejection coming from the sun. And we now know what kind of damage can be done. So you might think that, well, clearly we know that this is a threat, so certainly we should have done something about it, right? We as the United States of America. Unfortunately, what we've done about it is far too little. I mean, I literally just got off the phone with a manufacturer, and we're going to get to the good news, I promise. The manufacturer of technology that can block this current, a neutral ground blocker is what it's called. And he's sitting there, I mean, both of us, honestly, we both just prayed on the phone together. We prayed for the American people. We prayed that our grid doesn't go down. And we pray that enough people wake up to be able to use this technology, okay? Because unfortunately right now, what I can tell you is to prevent this kind of damage, we are completely unprepared as a nation. And it's not because we weren't warned. And I'm going to share a clip of a video that was taken almost exactly a month ago today. It was the same day of a solar eclipse. I testified before the U.S. Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, and her advisory board. And I pleaded with her, and I pleaded with her advisory board the same request I had made nearly 2 years ago, where I outlined for the Secretary and her advisory board the catastrophically low level of protection that we have. And I don't want to necessarily get into all the details about it. In fact, when you watch the clip that I'm going to splice into this video, you'll see me point to the level of protection. What I can tell you is we are unprotected. Why we are unprotected is because the electric power industry through the North American Electric Liability Corporation, NERC, created a protection standard that was approved by the federal government, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, that is so low that it requires no action, no actual hardware mitigation for the utility industry to stop those ground-induced currents. Okay, so now that we understand what a ground-induced current is and what kind of damage it will do, you need to understand that we are not protected. And you will see in a moment, I'm going to splice in the video where I tell the secretary, I plead with her to please take action. Okay? Let me clip to that video now.
Tommy Waller, you're our last commenter.
Sure. Well, Secretary, again, thank you for making the time. I don't know any other cabinet level official that has this type of access to the public, making this possible for us to be able to give you our public comments. David Borak has been exceptionally responsive as well. So I just want to thank you, number one. The previous speakers talked about the threat of solar weather. And I want to emphasize two recent events to set the stage for that discussion. One is the solar eclipse that we saw yesterday. And the second is that collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. So yesterday, 150 roughly Americans went up and looked at the sky. I did myself. I was here in Washington, D.C., FaceTiming with two of my daughters. They were in tears because there was clouds where they were and they couldn't see it. But what I thought about was how many Americans were looking up at the sky with glasses and seeing this amazing, opportunity for the sun to be blocked out and for it to get dark for just a few minutes. And how few of them understood that sun could black out our grid, not for a few minutes, but for potentially for years. And I thought about those two little girls that just wanted to see that eclipse and the statistical certainty, because it's probably 100%, that they're going to lose the grid in their lifetime. And the reason I say that is because, like we shared with you almost 2 years ago, the protection standard established for the protection of our grid against those harmful ground-induced currents, it's transparently defective. It's dangerous. The good news is, as we've shared, that there are solutions. In my written comments, I've provided an update. Doug Ellsworth mentioned there's at least 3 locations in the country. I want to thank the Department of Energy for installing at least 2 of these recently, neutral ground blockers. And look, our nonprofit takes no money from any organization that can profit off this. This is purely in the public interest. So I just, from the bottom of my heart and for the sake of my 2 little girls, ask you to look very closely at the risk, which is certain, and the cost, which is affordable, and the cost of not acting. The last piece I'll mention, the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Americans watched as this bridge collapsed, and it was a preventable catastrophe. Why? It was a known vulnerability. So they're asking themselves, why weren't the concrete dolphins put in place as a barrier, right? Here we sit, knowing that we're vulnerable to solar weather, knowing that there are workable, tested solutions that are affordable, that the 1/3 of 1% of the infrastructure bill. But I don't know if we have a solar storm that takes the grid down, I don't know if there's going to be a chance for people to look back and say, well, we should have, because the consequences will be that bad. So again, from the bottom of my heart, I just ask you to take action on this, and I'm available here in DC if needed to collaborate as you see fit. So thank you again for giving me the opportunity.
Thanks, Tommy. Appreciate it, Tommy.
Now, you heard me give the secretary credit. I mean, at least as a cabinet level official, she's inviting this testimony. What I'll tell you is I have not been contacted by anybody at the Secretary of Energy's advisory board to do any kind of collaborative follow-up. But I'll tell you who I am being contacted by is Americans all over the country right now who are seeing these news headlines and saying, what do we do? Well, I'm going to tell you what we can do, a few things. And this is the good news, right? The good news is, as you heard me say to the secretary, there's technology that exists that has been proven and tested that works to protect the grid. And Primus is solid ground technology that will block those currents. And literally, like right now, I'm getting text messages from the CEO of Imprimis where he's telling me every time one of these devices are activating, they're activating right now. What I want you to know about that is the utility industry, they expect that the worst of these storms won't happen until tomorrow. And yet right now in the crust of the earth, ground-induced currents are being detected and mitigated by 3 neutral ground blockers manufactured by Imprimis, one in Wisconsin, one in South Dakota, and another one somewhere in the TVA grid. I'm not going to say what state it's in. The technology works. It's happening right now. The problem is, for the entire United States, we need about 7,000 of these things to be installed to actually protect the entire grid. Now, I didn't get into it in my video with the Secretary of Energy about the cost. I did say that the costs were roughly 1/3 of 1% of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. That's what I told him 2 years ago. I've told him and written articles about this constantly, did everything I can to try to encourage the U.S. federal government to spend the money. Okay, it's about $4 billion nationwide. They've refused to do it. So we have a fixable problem, which is good news because it's fixable. Unfortunately, the federal government willfully refuses to fix it. Their solution right now is just for the utility industry to shut the grid down preemptively when they get notice of an impending solar storm. So if you get this video and you watch it and the lights go out, it could be because the industry decided that they're going to shut the grid down preemptively to save it, because those are the procedures that they have right now. I don't trust that they're going to do it. Personally, I don't think they'll do it. I think there's too much liability that they say that that's their procedure, but they won't actually do it. So if the lights did go out for some reason, it's most likely because there was a ground-induced current that caused a failure to transformer. How long it'll take to come back, I don't know. Now, I'm not saying this to cause fear. Honestly, I don't think that this is going to be some gigantic catastrophic solar storm like the Carrington event, right? I already told you I haven't compared the levels that they're predicting to the levels that we know yet. I haven't done that comparison. I haven't had time. But here's what I do know. I feel absolutely helpless. And so does the manufacturer of Imprimis right now. If it was a Carrington class solar storm, if it was one that was gigantic, right? And we don't have to be helpless because a solution exists. Here's some more good news. The state of Texas has its own grid. After Winter Storm Uri, it worked extremely hard to create an actual standard to protect its grid against cold weather. It did more than has ever been done by the industry anywhere else on that particular threat. Of course, it took over 240 Americans dying and hundreds of billions of dollars worth of economic loss for the people of Texas to be willing to allow their money through the rate base, right? The rates that they pay for electricity to be spent on protecting the grid. As you saw in my video to the Secretary of Energy, if we don't proactively protect our grid against solar weather and a huge storm hits, we may not have a second chance because of the amount of time it'll take to rebuild. These transformers, some of the lead times for these transformers are 4 to 6 years, right? We will not come back from that if we don't protect the grid if it's a large enough solar storm. Similarly, nuclear electromagnetic pulse produces ground-induced currents, the E3 part of the pulse. I'm not going to get into a whole description of the various parts of a nuclear EMP, E1, E2, E3. I will tell you that I can come back in the future and do that. I did serve in terms of credibility, like why do you want to believe this guy? I was asked to serve in official capacity as a major and as a lieutenant colonel as part of the U.S. Air Force Electromagnetic Defense Task Force, or EDTF, right? So I'm not telling you these things from a position of not knowing. And unfortunately, far too often, when people care about these issues, whether it be nuclear EMP or solar weather, the rest of society ridicules them. They say, where's your tinfoil hat, right? Why do you have to be apocalyptic, right? And then they attach that term apocalyptic to anybody who's actually preparing for such a thing. You're an apocalyptic prepper. I would ask anybody who's watching this right now to ask themselves, what would they do if the lights went off right now? Where would you get your water? What would happen to the food in your refrigerator? How long would it last? What kind of backup power do you have to preserve that food? And you just take the length of time for the power being out and think about the consequences that come with it. That's not being apocalyptic. It's being prudent, right? And so there is an element here for our country where preparedness is a national security imperative. And I'm just gonna use one example here, right? Because when we think about preparedness, obviously we need to think about life. 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. How much water do you have? How much food do you have, right? Well, I can tell you as a nation, as the US government has not incentivized preparedness. So I'm going to just take one example, and that's food. And the only reason I'm doing this for y'all in the context of this discussion is to inspire you to get serious about preparedness and also advocacy for security and protecting this infrastructure. Let's take one example, because our Center for Security Policy has done an entire study on food security, right? Less than 1% of our population produces the food consumed by the other 99% of the population. The average American makes 1.6 visits to the grocery store every week. The average piece of food that comes to our table travels over 1,500 miles. The average grocery store has what is needed for its immediate region's population for between 1 and 3 days max. Regional grocery distribution centers could have up to 2 weeks to 30 days worth of food requiring refrigeration for that distribution. And that's it. The United States of America has a strategic national stockpile. During the Cold War, that stockpile, it included food. It doesn't anymore. There's no food in the strategic national stockpile. FEMA has a series of warehouses. I'm not going to say the number of the warehouses, and I'm not going to say where they are, but they do have MREs. And FEMA is prepared to respond to natural disasters. FEMA is not prepared to respond to long-term, widespread power outages. I could show you, I'm not going to pull it up, but I have PowerPoint slides from FEMA presentations in 2018 that say exactly that. To credit the previous administration's FEMA executives, Brock Long, in fact, the guy in charge of FEMA, he said, we need a culture of preparedness. And FEMA was working on that, right? And right now, if you go to FEMA's website, you will see nothing about a culture of preparedness. Everything you will see will have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay? Why do I share that with you? Because the cavalry's not coming if the lights go out. The U.S. federal government will not be there to help you. It will be up to you. It'll be up to you and however much you've prepared at the family and the community level. And it'll be up to your state. I'm happy to say that there are some states that have taken action. I'm not going to say which ones, but I have flown all over this country over the last 10 years and helped inform people about these threats. Some states are taking it seriously. Some states have actually done public service announcements to have their populations begin preparing and just having food, having, weeks worth of food on hand. All I'm saying is every level of preparedness that you have will help. It'll help you personally. It'll help your community. It'll help your state. It'll help the U.S. in our national security. You think about 2 years ago in December, the people of Moore County, North Carolina, all of a sudden the lights went out. Not from a solar storm, but from rifle fire. 2 transformer substations simultaneously attacked by people with guns. It can happen anytime, anywhere. Look at how many people have come across this border who could do exactly the same thing. You may not have advance notice when the lights go out for you. So to the extent that you can be personally prepared, you need to do it. But I don't want to end on just that. I want you to be inspired to prepare. And of course, we have resources. I'm not the world's foremost expert on preparedness, and I'll tell you who is. Jonathan Hollerman. You want to go and learn, you go to griddownconsulting.com, you read the book Survival Theory. If you want to know all about that on a personal level, you can do that. Great. I would encourage you to do that as best you can. But I will tell you this. It's not just about personal preparedness. It's about community resilience. Our Center for Security Policy has something called the Resilient Community Network. I would encourage you to go to our website, centerforsecuritypolicy.org. Click on the Infrastructure Security tab, and you'll see a spot where it says that you can invite briefings to your emergency managers, where I will fly in and brief them. I've done that before, all over the country. If you want, take a look at Waldo County, Maine. look at at the report that we produced, where an emergency manager took this seriously and started an entire process to make sure that he has infrastructure that can operate off the grid. He's already preparing for the food issues that could happen, right? What I'm telling you is that these are fixable problems, and we've been helping people fix them, but it takes people getting involved. So don't take the information that I'm telling you and just think about running to the frontier. In fact, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, who was the chief of staff of the Congressional EMP Commission, he once said, Tommy, he said, this is scary stuff. And it often makes people want to run to the frontier. And, you know, the founders of the country had an infinite frontier to run to. And they didn't. They turned and they fought tyranny. And they won. What each and every single one of us need to do, yes, we need to be prepared. We need to fight the tyranny of inaction. And that's exactly what we're doing at this Center for Security Policy. And let me just tell you, you may have heard it in that briefing to the Secretary of Energy. We don't take money from the government. We don't take money from the utility industry, from any industry. Look, I've had the owners of companies come up to me at conferences and slap me on the back and say, Tommy, you're doing a great job. Shake my hand, and I look in my hand, and there's a check. And they have no idea how bad I need that check. And I hand it right back to them. Because that's not why we're doing it. We're doing it for you, the American people. But we are a nonprofit, right? And we can't do what we're doing without donations. So what I'm going to ask you to do, number one, be more prepared. Number two, you need to be more active. You go to our website, centerforsecuritypolicy.org. You click on infrastructure security. You go there and you set up a briefing for me to brief your emergency managers. I'll do it, right? I can do it remotely, or I'll fly in and do it. And then you help us get the resources that we need to keep it going, right? You donate. And one of the things that came to mind as I was thinking about how do I even ask people for money? Honestly, it makes me really uncomfortable. But I'm going to do it. And I'm going to put it in the context of that same discussion that I just had about the founders. 1776. What we're trying to preserve is what they created in 1776. Because it's not just the infrastructure, right? There are hostile ideologies that threaten this republic every day. You see it across campuses right now, right? You see it globally, and you see it here at home. Things that threaten our way of life, right? And I took an oath. I took an oath to the U.S. Constitution. And this copy of the Constitution was given to me by the parents of a Marine who we lost in combat overseas. And they said, never forget what he died for. And I never will. And what we're trying to protect is what they started in 1776. Okay? And so I got thinking about 1776. Probably every American could do 1776 a month. It's less than 60 cents a day. So if the message that I'm conveying to you about the work that we do, if you think it matters enough to help, then I would encourage you to do that and go and donate $17.76 a month to get started, to keep the fuel in the gas tank for me to get across this country, to keep briefing the people who need to know what to do about what threatens the republic. Right now, it's a geomagnetic disturbance. It's a solar storm heading towards Earth. It's going to get here over the next 24, 48 hours, and we're going to see what happens. But I can tell you what's happening already. There's ground-induced currents in this crust of the Earth, right? So what am I going to encourage you to do? Obviously, support us in our mission. Continue to get smart on the threats to the republic. Prepare yourself for hard times coming. And pray. Because ultimately, we're not in charge, right? And so if you're inspired right now in all these areas, I would ask you to not just seek support from organizations like us and support us, but get your spiritual house in order as well. Because at the end of the day, that's probably what matters most. Thank you for, well, it was supposed to be like 5 minutes. It's almost 20. But thank you for listening. I wanted to make this video because a lot of people have been asking questions. And so I gave you about as many answers as I can. And I'd be happy to produce more of these in the future to give you as much more as I can to know how to keep our country safer.